Metrocop Scene. This is another scene designed to make it clear that the Metrocops are the bad guys, except this time the player has a weapon and can finally do something about it. That something comes out of the barrel of a gun. We knew we needed the player to feel righteous, and this moment was part of creating that. The Metrocops are still human, unlike the rest of the Combine in the game, so we felt like we had to go the extra mile in making sure the player's actions felt like justice and not just wrath.
Staircase. There are situations throughout the game that stem from simple and quite straightforward design goals, and this staircase features two of them. The first was to frame the Citadel as it awakened, showing the player they stirred up the hive. The second was to showcase our ragdoll system. While it's standard now, in 2004 it was still a novelty to see bodies tumble realistically, and stairs provided a perfect stage to make that happen.
City 17 awakens. The early train station section was designed to make the city feel indifferent toward the player, as if Gordon is just another nameless, faceless citizen, ripe for subjugation. But during the tenement raid and rooftop chase, the city identifies the player as an anomaly and starts to stir. Now, with the player as the aggressor, the city fully turns its attention on them. The Overwatch PA system, first heard during the raid, played a key role in delivering this message. If players listen closely, there's a lot of information about the city's awareness. Even when players didn't pay attention, though, the audio treatment still conveyed the emotional message we were aiming for.
Explosive barrels. Here, we introduce explosive barrels, a staple of first-person shooters, but with a new twist. The second pistol shot sets the barrel on fire, starting a timed detonation. A third shot will detonate the barrel immediately. This way, players could either delay the explosion or trigger it right away, depending on the situation. Players may want to feed an explosive barrel to a Barnacle and then shoot it twice as a handy way to safely dispatch a cluster of them. The delayed explosion also made for more interesting chain reactions between multiple barrels. Exploding barrels were a fan favorite in the series, but also were internally favored by level designers who often felt like the game could never have enough of them.
Scanners. Scanners presented a tricky game design challenge. While we liked how their dystopian presence helped convey the Combine occupation as an oppressive surveillance state, we didn't actually want them to shoot at the player. We found that aiming into the sky to hit a small mobile enemy with a constant height advantage was something we couldn't make fun. Since we loved their role in the story, we decided that in combat, scanners would serve primarily as eyes, alerting nearby enemies to the player's presence, a feature we reinforced with sound effects from the soldiers. Beyond that, they'd only be able to harass the player with bright lights and occasionally dive bomb after taking enough damage.
Overwatch. During development, we generated the Overwatch voice using a free text-to-speech tool, but as we neared shipping, we realized we didn't actually have the rights to use it, so we held auditions with voice actors to find someone who could match the qualities we liked in the generated lines. It didn't take long before we found Ellen McLean, whose delivery was exactly what we were looking for. In her sessions, we played the generated lines for her to mimic, though in her own style. She was a bit sarcastic at first, given that she was being asked to replicate such a robotic delivery, but years later when she returned for her iconic role as GLaDOS in Portal, she'd found a way to creatively integrate that tone into her performance.
Lambda caches. Technically, the first Lambda cache is at Kleiner's lab, but this is the first one the player finds on their own. We added Lambda caches to encourage exploration and to hint players where hidden resources could be found, with a fiction being that they were being placed by the Resistance as part of their underground rebellion. In Half-Life, the contents of supply crates were predetermined by the level designer. In Shell 2, we introduced adaptive item crates that give the player whatever they are low on at the time, based on resource targets set by the level designer.
Pistol design. The standard pistol is the workhorse of the game, functioning not only as the first range weapon you learn to use, but also as a method to interact with physics and destructible objects at a safe distance for the entirety of the game. To help make it feel more responsive and fun to use, the pistol employs a refire mechanic that's unique to it in the game. The gun will fire as fast as the player can click their input button, meaning that they feel an instant response to their input, and the faster they can click, the faster they can shoot. Shatter glass. When designing early levels where there are fewer mechanics in the player's toolkit, we found that it's just as engaging to spotlight new technical features instead. as we did here with breakable glass. For the shattering effect, glass was divided into a grid of small squares, allowing us to track which were intact or broken, and to blow at larger sections once enough squares were no longer connected. Each square was rendered with a unique texture based on the status of its neighboring squares, creating the sharp, jagged edges between broken and intact glass. While breaking glass is now commonplace in games, it was something we hadn't seen much back when we were making Half-Life 2, and we're incredibly happy with the level of fidelity and dynamicism it brought to the game.
Helicopter Peekaboo. The Combine attack helicopter as central antagonist was something we wanted to develop throughout the entire chapter. The relentless chopper became a character in its own right. Here, if you listen and look overhead, you can hear its engine and see it flying along the train tracks and into the distance. This first glimpse is a small piece of foreshadowing, with its presence becoming more pronounced over time, until eventually you're squaring off against it.
Iterative passes. Some chapters of the game, such as the on-foot sections of the canals in Ravenholm, were developed in multiple passes by different cabals. We found that handing off maps in this way led to greater variety in the experience, and a higher density of interesting moments, as each cabal added their unique touches to the maps. In the on-foot portion of the canals, the first pass established the art direction and the player path, along with the broad strokes of the experience and some major beats. But the team-wide alpha playtest identified insufficient tension and a somewhat monotonous experience here. In our second pass, we returned to the map solely focused on creating that tension and greatly increased the density of moment-to-moment scenarios.
Water shader. The most complex shader we made for the game was the water shader, which made full use of the newly available programmable graphics cards. When water was present, the scene was rendered 3 times. First, the underwater world for refraction, second, a reflected view, and third, the parts above the water. When rendering the water surface, we blended the refractive and reflective views, showing more reflection at glancing angles using the Fresnel equation. We also tracked the ground depth below the water's surface, making it more transparent and less refractive in shallow areas. Additionally, we had to create 2 alternate water rendering techniques for lower-end graphics cards. Mid-range cards displayed a lower detail reflection without refraction or transparency, while low-end cards only rendered a partially transparent surface.
Interstitial scenes. As playtesting progressed, we often found areas where players lost track of their goal, which isn't uncommon in a game like Half-Life. To address this, we added smaller interstitial scenes to help guide players along their path and reinforce their objective. After finishing the bulk of development on our larger choreo scenes, like Kleiner's Lab, putting these smaller scenes together became relatively straightforward. We discovered that using characters in these moments worked much better than relying on passive storytelling, or even some sort of reminder you'd find baked into a pause menu.
Joel, to get you going.
Boxcar Bill. This small scene originally featured 2 human characters, but later in development, we replaced one with a Vortigaunt. We wanted to show that Vortigaunts were coexisting with humans and resisting the Combine as well. We also introduced their ability to heal the player, although we didn't fully capitalize on that feature throughout the game. Vortigaunts became a useful narrative tool for keeping dialogue brief, as their hive mind justified their full knowledge of the world and the player's goals. This meant they never had to ask questions, neatly sidestepping the challenge of writing dialogue for a silent protagonist.
Barnacle Introduction. Because barnacles can be confusing when first encountered, we wanted to introduce them in a way that showed players their behavior at a safe distance. We decided to do that through a nature show-style predator-prey scene. But, as always, scenes like this took a lot of iteration to get players to reliably see.
Surface properties. We play custom footstep sounds when the player walks on the slippery mud. This was a system called Surface Properties that used the material type to determine the sounds and other effects that should occur when walked on or shot at. Earlier in development, we had an effect that slowed players' movement when walking on mud surfaces. However, this was removed in the shipping version as it was decided it was too punishing.
Duty, sword, midnight.
Mounted gun gallery. There are a few things going on in this scene. The turret firing at the breakable crates behind teaches players not to take the threat head-on, and instead utilize the sewer route to defeat it. And when they reach the turret, players enjoy using it in a shooting gallery with a wave of Combine soldiers and dive-bombing scanners. We also begin to introduce the missile-firing Combine APC that pushes the players along and will show up again later in the chapter.
Running around a corner into a new area just to see enemies standing there is always awkward, and it makes the world feel less alive and more like a shooting gallery. So we were motivated to introduce enemies into combat spaces in more interesting and dynamic ways that would communicate planning and intentionality on their part, as if these soldiers had had a plan for Gordon even before he showed up. The Metro Cops in this scene jump down into this space via scripted sequences. Later in the game we use rappelling in a similar way. It doesn't matter where they're coming from in reality because players end up telling that story to themselves. We found that in the end, combat should have a story implied in its setup. An ambush, a surprise, a surge, an assault. All of these scenarios use much of the same enemy AI, but all felt different to playtesters.
Barnacle bowling. This is a satisfying example of Barnacle bowling. This is a satisfying example of how a bunch of design elements can come together in a matrix of interactions to create a memorable scenario for the player. We got barnacles, our physics simulations, slippery mud surface properties, and last but not least, explosive barrels. You've encountered all of these on their own, but they're able to snap together naturally to create a moment we called Barnacle bowling.
Physics in puzzles. Often, simpler mechanics encountered earlier in the game are pulled from more complex ones as a form of training. The teeter-totter puzzle, the first physics-based contraption in the game, was actually derived from a later, more intricate washing machine puzzle in the canals. The teeter-totter uses the same principles of mass and ramps, but in a more straightforward way that players can directly interact with, helping them understand the game's physics and making later puzzles easier to tackle. This puzzle also highlights the analog nature of the physics system, with the placement of cement blocks and the player's own weight both factoring into the solution.
Combine attack helicopter. Players have had glimpses before, but here is where we fully introduce the main boss of the Canals chapter, the Combine attack helicopter. This chopper relentlessly destroys a player's cover, forcing them to move forward or risk being gunned down. We wanted this sequence to feel tense and menacing, with the helicopter seeming far too powerful to confront directly, and maintaining that intensity through the canals until the final showdown in the reservoir. To achieve this, we heavily constrained the helicopter's movement based on specific gameplay goals. In this map, designed as a dash from cover to cover under helicopter fire, we created a ring path in the sky above the arena. The helicopter always travels to the farthest point on that ring from the player, keeping it visible and making it easier for us to place cover in just the right spot.
Normal maps. Half-Life 2 was developed during an exciting time for graphics, as the first programmable shader-supported graphics cards were hitting the market. Using this technology, we became one of the first games to implement normal maps, a technique that enhanced the lighting on surface geometry. The normal map described the surface's roughness, allowing each pixel of a polygon to be lit in a way that made surfaces appear bumpier and more detailed than ever possible in Half-Life 1.
Autosave dangerous. In Half-Life 1, we had a set of autosaves throughout the game, hand-placed by level designers and triggered when the player reached some specific moment or position in the game. This ensured that the game was automatically saved for you as you traversed through Black Mesa's corridors. In Half-Life 2, we found ourselves needing a new tool. The problem arose in some of the more complex arenas we'd built. Some of those encounters would last for quite a while and features multiple sets of enemies. Others were long, sprawling mixes of exploration and combat without any clear separation between the two. We never want an autosave where the player is in danger of dying right after loading the game, because that could place the player in a death loop. If you played enough games back then, you definitely found yourself in this situation at least once. So unless we deliberately crafted pauses in every arena's flow, there wasn't always a safe place to put an autosave. After some experimentation, we implemented a feature called Autosave Dangerous. This was a level designer tool that combined an autosave with an associated time frame. When triggered by the level designer, it immediately saved the game, but kept the save off to the side, not available as a save game to load from. If the player then stayed alive for the specified time frame, then the save would be committed and used as the most recent autosave. This allowed level designers to put an autosave at a reasonable place or time in an arena, specify a time, like 30 seconds, and if the player was still alive for 30 seconds, the autosave would be used.
Soundscapes.
In Half-Life 1, ambient sounds were placed by hand and then individually tuned. For Half-Life 2, we wanted more ambient sounds in our environment with higher quality and less manual effort for placement. So we built a system that we call the Soundscape system. A soundscape is basically a small program that controls which ambient sounds play, where they come from, and then how they behave in a specific environment. So flies buzzing, wind blowing, birds, a distant train, distant combat. The soundscape system could then randomly select and play these sounds and also, really importantly, handle the smooth transition as the player moves through environments. Soundscapes can also contain other soundscapes, and that allows us to create reusable collections of sounds. So, for instance, distant combat might be small arms fire, distant explosions, a passing helicopter. And these soundscapes would dynamically assemble and play from many individual sounds, and that helps us avoid the artificial feel of a single looping track. Overall, the soundscape system was a real workhorse for audio in Half-Life 2, and it's pretty much responsible for every sound you hear that isn't directly driven by gameplay.
Get in here. Manhack map. We called this guy Manhack map. We wanted to give players the sense that hundreds of citizens inhabited the hidden nooks and crannies of City 17. At this point in the game, it had been a while since players had seen a citizen, and we wanted to explain the significance of the Manhacks, which was the first physics-based enemy that we created. In the original concept, there was a video arcade in the city where players could fly Manhacks around to attack virtual citizens. Eventually, players would discover that the Manhacks were real, and so were the citizens. As the Combine occupation became more fleshed out, this idea of a video arcade became an odd fit and eventually fell by the wayside.
Explosive Barrel Factory. This room, filled with an absurd number of exploding barrels, inspired some good-natured debate within the team around how far to push the plausibility of our world. Frankly, one exploding barrel is probably too many in regards to realism. In the real world, barrels really shouldn't explode, even if you were to shoot them.
Rising water. The floating bridge and wooden spools here introduce the concept of buoyancy as a tool for the player. In this case, it's not really a puzzle. It's just some fun for the player interacting with the physics system. But later, we revisit this gameplay element in the canals to raise a ramp for the airboat.
Rendering systems. In the early 2000s, we couldn't afford a general-purpose renderer with the broad capabilities of a modern engine. Instead, CPU, GPU, and memory limitations required highly specific solutions to rendering challenges so we could squeeze every bit of performance out of a player's hardware. As a result, Half-Life 2 actually has 3 different rendering engines. One for world geometry, another for outdoor terrain, and a third for dynamic entities like characters and objects. These 3 renderers had to support a complicated matrix of features: collisions, ray traces, decals, offline lighting, visibility calculations, and more. On top of that, each renderer needed to support DirectX 7, 8, and 9. The differences among these DirectX versions were significant, often requiring different data storage and rendering approaches. They even used different programming languages. Altogether, we essentially had 9 different renderers, each needing unique solutions, and getting them all to look consistent was one of the most challenging tech problems we faced during development.
GPU Wild West. During development, we faced numerous decisions influenced by our choice of minimum spec, the least powerful CPU and GPU combination that would still deliver a good experience for customers. In the early 2000s, there was far more variety among GPUs than today, with wide differences not only in speed, but in fundamental approaches to rendering. But at the time, we had no real data on the hardware our customers were using. What CPUs and GPUs did they have? How much RAM? Which version of Windows? We reached out to Microsoft hoping they might know answers to questions like, how many DX7 cards are in use? Or DX8? Unfortunately, they didn't have the data either. Realizing we were at risk of making bad decisions without these insights, we developed an analysis tool that allowed players to report their hardware specs to us and integrated it into the early version of Steam. The data was so useful that we decided to make it public, launching the Steam Hardware Survey in April 2003. It's been helping us and hopefully other developers make informed decisions ever since.
Go on!
Dynamic shadows. With a focus on character and physics objects, we felt a dynamic shadow system was necessary to render them all in all their glory. In 2003, GPUs didn't have any dedicated shadow capabilities that they have today, so performance was a tricky problem. Our eventual solution went something like this, running every frame. First, find all the objects that might have shadows in view. Doing this meant figuring out which objects were in the view frustum, or slightly behind it, to catch entities that were off-screen but whose shadows might end up on-screen. Then we'd render a black shadow version of each one of those objects into a single shadow texture. For that render, we'd use the lowest level of detail model for the object to be as fast as possible. Finally, we'd use the shadow texture to draw each of the shadows into the player's view, darkening the already rendered pixels. We'd carefully cut around each shadow in that shadow texture to ensure that they correctly overlaid each other in the case where multiple shadows overlap. It's neat to look back on how we did these things, but ultimately we're a lot happier today, where GPU hardware makes it a much more straightforward problem.
They're showing us!
Headcrab canisters. Used headcrab canisters are seen later in Ravenholm, so we decided to show them here to tell the story of how they're used by the Combine. The story is that the Combine have weaponized Zen fauna to use them against the humans. Burrowed headcrabs was added as a new feature for this section that was expanded into a larger area that is meant to show a citizen shanty that was decimated by the headcrab assault.
Airboat intro. This is where the player gets the first vehicle of the game, the airboat. We wanted to create a safe space for players to practice driving the airboat for as long as they wanted before moving on. The arena is sprinkled with opportunities for jumps and tricks, and we filled the arena with toxic slime to keep players in the airboat longer, while preventing them from leaving the vehicle behind and progressing forward on foot.
Combinatorial shader explosion. Rendering became much more complex during Half-Life 2's development with the addition of hardware shaders, small bits of code controlling how each pixel on a surface should render. In 2003, shaders were far more limited than today. Half-Life 2 era shaders lacked conditionals and had severe code size restrictions. This meant no if-else branching logic to adjust based on different conditions, and no large shaders with broad feature sets. Also, compiling shaders as needed was just too slow to be useful, so we had to pre-compile them. To work within these limits, we had to compute every possible shader combination and store each one individually as its own shader. For example, if a shader affected a surface based on a single light source, we'd need another shader version for 2 lights, another for 3, and so on. And it was combinatorial. If that shader also supported a normal map, we'd need 2 versions per light, one with a normal map and one without. With features like texture blending, vertex tinting, specular highlights, alpha testing, and various other light types, directional point and spotlights, our shader count exploded. By release, we had thousands of individual shaders. Shortly after, we released Lost Coast adding HDR support, which doubled the shader count again. Once compiling shaders on the local developer's machine started taking too long, we switched to distributing the shader compiles over the entire network using VMPI. We also had a dynamic shader compilation mode that was useful for developing shaders that gave fast turnaround at the expense of frame rate hitching when a shader had to be compiled.
Fighting motion sickness. In early playtesting, many players developed motion sickness while driving the airboat. While trying to fix this, we discovered several factors that contributed to it. We found that reducing the intrusion of the airboat into the view helped, so we made several passes on the model to pare it back. Maintaining a consistent frame rate helped as well, so it was important to keep an eye on performance in these sections. However, the single most important factor was eliminating view roll to maintain a more stable horizon no matter what the airboat was doing. One of the programmers on the team was super prone to motion sickness, and they valiantly offered to playtest several times to test our progress towards a solution. I'm pretty sure they threw up at least once after playtesting, and their noble sacrifice was hugely appreciated.